This video is an introduction to histology. Histology is the study of tissues. In this lesson, we will go through a brief overview of each of the four main types of tissues in the human body. Your body is made up of trillions of cells. However, as individual cells, they cannot perform the many functions of the human body. Therefore, cells will differentiate to have very specific functions. There are about 200 different types of cells in the human body. When these cells work together to perform a very specialized function, we call that a tissue. There are four groups of tissues in the human body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. These cells, working together to form tissues, are essentially the building blocks for the human body. The first group of cells that we will discuss are epithelial cells. Epithelial tissue have several general functions. One function is to offer protection. They cover and line the outside surface of the body and the internal surface of organs. Your skin is an example of an epithelial tissue. They form your glands and secrete chemicals, such as the thyroid gland. There are also single cells in something like the stomach that will secrete mucus to provide protection as well. Epithelial tissues can absorb, like the cells in your intestines can absorb nutrients. They can filter. Your kidney cells have specialized epithelial cells that filter wastes and produce urine. They will also offer diffusion. You have cells lining the blood vessels, and they allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse in and out of the bloodstream. Epithelial tissue have some general characteristics that make them different from the other tissues that we will discuss. The first characteristic is that epithelial tissue will always be exposed to a free edge. This is sometimes referred to as the apical surface. The outside environment or the inside of an organ would be considered a free edge, such as the skin being exposed to the outside environment. Epithelial tissue have cells that are very closely packed together. Epithelial tissue is avascular. A is the root word for knot. Vascular stands for vessels. This means that epithelial tissue does not have any blood vessels associated with it. Epithelial tissue will be attached to an underlying layer of connective tissue. This is referred to as the basement membrane. And with epithelial tissue, the cells can divide to replace old cells. This picture shows the general characteristics of epithelial tissue that was discussed on the previous slide. The blue arrow is pointing to the free edge in both a simple epithelial tissue, where there is just one layer of cells, and in a stratified epithelial tissue, where there are multiple layers of cells. The red arrow represents the basement membrane, which is holding the bottommost layer of cells to the underlying connective tissue. The dark purple arrow represents how close these cells are together. There is no space between one cell and the next. The light purple circles are the nucleus for each individual epithelial cell. The nucleus will be a good characteristic to look for when you are trying to identify epithelial tissue under the microscope. The next group of tissue that we are going to discuss is connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most diverse group of tissues that we have in the human body. They have many functions and they have many different characteristics. They will wrap and cushion organs to keep them protected. They help with storage of nutrients like your bones and fat cells. They help to transport nutrients and oxygen throughout the body like your blood. They provide internal support. They help attach muscle to bone and bone to bone, and they also provide strength and structure to the organs, such as your skin. Connective tissue will all share the same basic characteristics. They have what we call a ground substance. This is a substance that holds the fibers and the cells in their place. Ground substance can be very, very dense and thick to a fluid ground substance. Connective tissue will have specialized fibers. These are like ropes and strings that vary in strength and size, and they will also have different types of specialized cells. In this example of connective tissue, we can see some of the general characteristics that were mentioned on the previous slide. This is a sample of loose connective tissue. The first thing that we can see is the ground substance. The ground substance is the light purple area that looks like it's holding all of the cells and fibers in place. The fibers are the strings that you see running through this sample in different directions. There are thicker fibers and there are also thin fibers. We can also see some specialized cells. The largest cell in this picture is a fat cell. There are also some smaller cells, such as mast cells and fibroblasts as well. The third type of tissue that we find in the body is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue's main function is to provide contractions. This can cause body movement, transport materials, and it will also aid in digestion. There are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. The picture that you see here is a sample of skeletal muscle. We will discuss muscle tissue more in depth in a later lesson. The final type of tissue in the body is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue's main function is to send electrical signals. Nervous tissue is what makes up your brain and nerves. There are two types of nervous tissue, the neuron and neuroglia. Neuroglia are the support cells that keep neurons healthy. The picture that you see here is an example of a neuron. We will discuss neurons more in depth in a future lesson. In our next lessons, you will be asked to identify different types of tissues based on what they look like under a microscope. Here are some tips to help make tissue identification a little bit easier. The first thing, look for a free edge. If you see a free edge, you know that it has to be a type of epithelial tissue. Look for any distinct cell shapes. That will also tell you that it is an epithelial tissue. Look for fibers. If fibers are present, you know that you are looking at a connective tissue. Look for ground substance. Ground substance is also a clue that it is a connective tissue. Look for distinct cellular projections. Neurons have a very distinct shape, and that can give you a very good indication that it is a nervous tissue. And look for striations. Striation is a word that means stripes. Striations are a distinct characteristic of muscle tissue. Take a look at this sample of tissue. Using the tips discussed in the previous slide, see if you can identify the general tissue type. Is it epithelial, connective, muscle, or nervous? In this slide, I do not see a free edge. I also do not see very closely packed cells, so it's not epithelial. I'm looking at this slide and I do see fibers. I see things that look like strings running through this tissue, so this is a connective tissue. Try this example and see if you can identify the general tissue type in this picture. In this picture, I do not see any striations or cells that look like they are striped, so I know that it is not muscle tissue. I also do not see any cells with distinct cellular projections that would tell me that it is nervous tissue. Therefore, if I look at the top edge of this slide, I can see a free edge. That tells me that this has to be an epithelial tissue type. You have completed the first lesson, Introduction to Histology. In our next lesson, we will have a more in-depth discussion of epithelial tissue, and we will learn how to identify the different types of epithelial tissue under the microscope. Please go back and make sure that you have taken good notes on the general characteristics of each of the types of tissues in the human body.